So this morning, we're continuing our series that we called Model T. Because just like Henry Ford created the model for the automotive industry to chase after, there was one church, one group of people in the Bible that was called a model for every other congregation to follow. And that was the church in Thessalonica. These people were making such a huge impact in their city that this is what the Bible has to say about them. And so, which means as a result of the way that you live. And so you became a model to all the believers in Macedonia and Achaia. The Lord's message rang out from you not only in Macedonia and Achaia, your faith in God has become known everywhere. Now, this is the only church in all of the New Testament that the Bible calls a model. So for the past 5 weeks, we've been looking into what made this church so different. And this morning, we're going to be looking at one of the characteristics that made this group of people so unique. Look what the Bible says in 1 Thessalonians 4:9. Now, about your love for one another, we don't need to write to you, for you yourselves have been taught by God to love each other. And in fact, you do love all of God's family throughout Macedonia. Yet, we urge you, brothers and sisters, to do so more and more. Now, don't miss what the Bible is saying here. It's saying that one factor that set this church apart from the culture around it is that they truly cared about each other. And this was so remarkable because it was completely counterculture. See, at this time in history, people didn't look out for each other. They looked out for themselves. The average person lived day to day. They didn't have savings. They weren't working for retirement. They were working to survive. And so if someone was looking out for someone else and they truly cared about them, that was strange. See, there was even a group of people at this era in history that believed that if you were truly happy and truly self-sufficient, that you didn't need friends. And so their whole goal in life was to become so happy that they didn't have to worry about anyone but themselves. But see, Paul tells this church that they stand out. They're different than the rest of their town who only looks out for themselves. He says, as a matter of fact, you're so good at this, you need to spend more time doing it because you're making a difference. And look what he says next. And make it your ambition. I want to stop right there because we all know what ambition is, right? It's our goals for our life, what we're working towards. And Paul says, and make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. So he tells this church, you want something to work towards? You want a goal for your life? Here it is. Don't make it your ambition to be rich or to be famous like everyone else. No, make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. And now, I can imagine the people who are reading this letter going, okay, hold up. I don't want to live a quiet life. I want to be noticed. I want to make a dent. I want people to remember me. So why would Paul say this? Why in the world would his advice to this church be, live a quiet life? Well, it's because the city of Thessalonica was anything but a quiet town. I mean, remember what happened to Paul when he visited these people? Let's look back at what the Bible has to say about it. When Paul and his companions had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. As was his custom, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. This Jesus I'm proclaiming to you is the Messiah, he said. Some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. But other Jews were jealous. So they rounded up some bad characters from the marketplace, formed a mob, and started a riot in the city. See, this was not a quiet town. And in order for these verses to make sense, you have to understand what the Bible means when it talks about the marketplace. See, Thessalonica was a surprisingly large city for this time in history because it was in the perfect location for trade. So the marketplace was the center of everything in town. And now the Thessalonian marketplace was over twice as big as the West Side Market. So you can imagine that there were always people walking around. But Thessalonica had an unusually large amount of people who hung out there all day. And there was an interesting reason why. See, the Roman Empire had this practice called the cura annone, which translates to the grain dole or the grain allowance. And by about 60 BC, over 200,000 Roman citizens were receiving free grain every month to make the bread they needed to survive. But see, this program wasn't set up like our modern government assistance programs. It wasn't where people under a certain income level get access to subsidized services. No, to be part of this program, you had to have a ticket. And you couldn't just apply for one, because these tickets were very valuable, and there were only a certain number of them. So people would sell theirs to the highest bidder, or they would keep them in their family and give them as an inheritance to their children. So you knew that if you had access to the grain dole, that you would be set for life. And see, this caused a really interesting thing to happen, because historians say that Thessalonica had an unusually large amount of people who had access or tickets to the grain dole. And as a result, there were a lot of people who were perfectly healthy and they could work for a living, but they chose not to because their family had had a ticket for generations. So instead of working, these people started to gather in the marketplace all day long. And so when the Bible talks about the Jewish people rounding up bad characters from the marketplace, this is who it was talking about. People who all they did was stir up trouble. And so when Paul says to lead a quiet life, he's saying, don't be like the people you see in the market. It doesn't stop there. Look what he says in the rest of this verse. And to make it your ambition to lead a quiet life, you should mind your own business. See, Paul doesn't mince words here. He says, don't worry about what everyone else is doing. Worry about your own life. Because the whole reason that Paul got run out of Thessalonica and a riot started was because people didn't mind their own business. So Paul tells these believers, don't live that way. Don't get involved in the drama swirling around town. Don't get sucked into did you hear what he said or she did? And don't stir up controversy. Make it your ambition to lead a quiet life and mind your own business. In fact, I had this youth minister growing up who was amazing at minding his own business. Whenever a student would walk up to him and say, hey, did you hear what so-and-so did or so-and-so said? He would stop him and say, okay, as much as I want to hear this, I want you to know, anything you say, I'm going to go to this person, I'm going to tell them what you said, and I'm going to use your name as my source. So, if you're not okay with that, you probably shouldn't tell me. And miraculously, not very many people told him the rumors they heard. So see, maybe this is for you. Maybe if you're in junior high or high school, this means that when people start talking about other students, that instead of getting in the middle of it, maybe you just walk away because it's not your business anyway. But Paul didn't just tell them to mind their own business. Look what he says next. You should mind your own business and work with your hands, just as we told you. Again, he's saying live differently than these bad characters from the marketplace. So many of the problems in Thessalonica were a result of people who spent all of their time getting involved in other people's business instead of working. So Paul says, find a job and work hard. Because if you work, you have a lot less time for drama. Now, Thessalonica was a big town and they had a lot of jobs, but it wasn't like today's world. Most people didn't work at the same place every day. Most people didn't have benefits or health care plans or tenure or matched 401ks. See, the average worker would get up early and they go into the marketplace and they would all gather in one place. And throughout the morning, supervisors and employers would come by and they'd be looking for workers. And they would say, hey, I need this job done and I'll pay this much for one day's work. So you'd go with them and you'd do the work. But then you'd probably be back in the same place the next day, hoping someone else had a job for you. And there weren't always enough jobs for everyone in town, and so every day there was a chance that you wouldn't be able to find work. Now, some of you might be thinking, okay, why is Paul telling this church to do these things? I mean, he kind of sounds like my parents when I was 17. Zach, get a job. Zach, mind your own business. But see, Paul isn't telling them to do these things just so they don't get in trouble or to make Paul's life easier. There's a much bigger reason. Look what he told them the result would be at the end of verse 12. And to make it your ambition to lead a quiet life, you should mind your own business and work with your hands, just as we told you, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders, and so that you will not be dependent on anybody. So he's saying that if you mind your own business and you work, two things will happen. First off, the people around you will notice. They'll see that you're never the ones getting into trouble. And maybe they'll start to change their views of Christians and they'll start to respect you. And that goes a long way. Because if the norm in our culture is to try to get everyone to look at us and pay attention to us and be right in the middle of all the drama, people who live differently stand out. Now, growing up, I was a sports fanatic. I mean, I definitely grew up in a sports family. Specifically, we watched a lot of football. So if the Indianapolis Colts were on TV, we were watching. Actually, if there was any football on TV, we were watching. And I was obsessed. I mean, I knew every player on the Colts roster down to the long snapper. I mean, I knew coordinators, position coaches, front office, all of it. And I remember watching games with my dad every Sunday. But it always seemed like there were two games going on the field. I mean, the first one is obviously who can score more points than the other team, but there always seemed to be a second game going on of who could come up with a better touchdown celebration or sack celebration. And it always came down to guys like Randy Moss or Terrell Owens or even guys like Ickey Woods and Johnny Morton. And it was fun to watch, but I never really got into it. But there were a few players who hardly ever celebrated. And I would ask my dad, why don't they do a touchdown celebration like everyone else? And he said, well, Vince Lombardi used to always say, when you get to the end zone, act like you've been there before. And there were a lot of great coaches who used that phrase with their teams, like Paul Brown and Tom Landry. But there was one player who I remember who always played that way. And it was this short little running back named Barry Sanders. And now, I only remember watching the last couple of years of his career, but my dad would tell me about him, and that Barry Sanders was a household name. In just 10 years in the league, he retired with the second most rushing yards in NFL history, and he's still ranked third. But my favorite thing about him was that when he scored a touchdown, he really did act like he had been there before. Most of the time, he would cross the goal line, he'd slow down, and he'd hand the ball to the ref, and he'd jog back to the bench. And that was it. And that always stood out to me. That Sanders isn't remembered for his antics with the press or his lavish lifestyle or the crazy things he did off the field. No, he's remembered for living a quiet life, for minding his own business and working hard. And his abilities and his daily life won the respect of every player, coach, and fan. But see, earning respect isn't the only thing that Paul said would happen if this church followed these instructions. Look what he said next. So that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders and so that you will not be dependent on anybody. Now, like we talked about before, there was a group of people who depended on the Roman government for their food. And now these weren't the people who needed to be given assistance. They were whoever could afford a ticket or keep it in their family. So they were choosing to be dependent on the government. And because there were only so many tickets to go around, people who needed help didn't get it. And so Paul was saying, you shouldn't want to be dependent on someone else. If you're able to work, work. Because then not only do you not need someone else's help to survive, but then you can be the person who helps other people. And now, there were definitely individuals in the first century who didn't have this choice. It wasn't an option for them. They weren't able to work, whether that was because of health issues or other cultural issues. And Paul isn't saying that there is no excuse for not working. But he is saying, if you're able to, you should. Because there is a growing number of people in Thessalonica who just decided, I don't really want to work. I want someone else to take care of me. And it was causing a lot of problems in town. So, what does this mean for us in Cleveland, Ohio in 2019? How do Paul's words here make a difference in our daily life? I mean, is he saying that as long as we have a job, if we're able, and we don't start riots, that we're good? I mean, I think it goes a little bit deeper than that. Because like I said, Paul didn't tell them just to live a quiet life because I told you to. And he said, do this, and here's why. He told the congregation, live your lives differently than the norm, because then people will notice. So what does that look like for us? What would it look like for every one of us to mind our own business and work hard? Maybe if you're a student, next time something's going around on Snap and here's your opportunity to post something that's going to get you noticed, instead, you don't feed into the drama and just mind your own business. Or maybe you're at work and your manager says, these changes need to happen, and so now you don't roll your eyes and talk about them in the break room later. And what about working hard? Because, I mean, if we're honest, there's a lot of days where we're at school or work and we give 110%. And on our way home that day, we're proud of the work that we did. But then there are also days where we give 50% effort, 60% effort. And we say, well, I worked hard yesterday or last week, and so it kind of balances out. I mean, I'm just kind of tired today. But how much of a difference would it make if we made it our ambition to lead a quiet life, to mind our own business, and to work hard? If it wasn't something that we did sometimes or most of the time, but we made it our ambition, our goal to do it all the time. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Zach, no one is going to notice, even if I make changes. I mean, they're so absorbed in all their stuff that they're not even going to notice that I'm not in the middle of it anymore. But I disagree. See, when I became a father just over 2 years ago, I found out there were a handful of things that everybody would say to me. Things like, man, this baby is going to rock your world, and get ready for no sleep. And I would nod my head and laugh, but in typical early 20s style, I would think to myself, yeah, for the last 5 people said, surely it can't be this extreme. And now, once we had Amelia, I realized that almost everybody was spot on. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, I have absolutely loved being Amelia's dad, and I can't wait to meet our next child who's due in just a week. But there was one phrase that people would say to me that I honestly didn't believe. It was when people would tell me, be careful what you say around them. You'd be amazed at what they'll repeat. And I thought to myself, we're having a baby, not a parrot. I mean, you've got to be exaggerating. But Amelia's just over 2 now, and she hasn't learned any cuss words yet, but she has learned a few words that aren't necessarily toddler words. And I realized really quickly that I can't insult a referee's intelligence or eyesight unless I want her to do the same thing. And what I learned is there are people who notice what I say and do way more than I ever realized. And it made me stop and think to myself, how often do I think about how my actions affect other people? How much of an impact would it make if I really did mind my own business and work hard? I mean, that's what Paul was trying to teach the Thessalonian church. That if we commit ourselves to these things, that if we make it our ambition, our goal for our life, that it really can make a difference. Will you pray with me? God, I know that these verses, when you read them at first, it can be easy because I know I looked at it this way too. It's like, okay, I do that. I don't get involved in all this different stuff. I'm not a gossip. I don't slack off. I don't do all these things. So it doesn't really apply to me. And God, I know how easy it is to get there, but I think this is also one of those things where we can get here really quick. We can end up in this world really quickly and really easily. And so I pray that if there's people like me that felt that way when they first heard this, that we still take something away from this. There's a good reminder that this isn't just something that, yeah, we do that. We do it most of the time. We're really good about it. But no, that Paul said that this should be our ambition. The goal for our life should be to live a quiet life. And just give us some time this week to think about what that actually means for us. What would it look like for me to do that? Would people notice? Would it make a difference? And so, God, I'm so grateful that we get to come in together in this room every week and just talk about you and how we can take just one step closer to you. Not how we can just forget everything about who we are and change, but so that we can take one step to look a little bit more like you. We thank you so much for what you did on the cross through your Son, Jesus. We could never thank you enough. And it's his name that we pray. Amen.